Okay, so first of all, good afternoon. Thank you so much to everyone that's calling in. My name is Lauren Cooper. I'm the lead of the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University Forestry Department. And we're really pleased to host this learning session for the Forest Climate Working Group. I know that we do have some folks from outside of the group, so we're going to have Jad Daly and Rita Height speak for a minute about the Forest Climate Working Group and share a few other things. Real quickly, though, I'm thinking maybe before we do that, I should run over a couple of details. If you've called in on the phone, can you please make sure that you are muted because we can't mute you. So it would help reduce a little bit of the extra sound. And as many of you just heard, this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the web along with any supplemental resources. And we'll also post the presentation slides. We'll take care of this in the next week or so, and I'll reach out to let you know when that's completed and where you'll be able to find it. Furthermore, we're going to hold questions to the end. You can see on the interface there's a chat button above the list of participants, and that's where you can put questions in at any point, and we'll collect them and present them to our speakers during the Q&A. And if you're calling on the phone but have access to email, you're welcome to shoot me an email with a question, and we'll add it to the list. And that's at ltcooper@msu.edu. And if there are pending questions, I will work with our speakers to create a document and answer those questions, and we'll upload that along with the presentation materials. So I'll hand it over to Jad and Rita now.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. And I really want to thank you and the folks at Michigan State and Dave Cleaves, who's our coordinator for the Forest Climate Working Group, for doing a really great job establishing this new learning exchange and getting a great suite of initial presentations put together, and in particular getting this first session put together with a couple of really impressive speakers, Chris Swanston and Sheldon Zakreski from Climate Trust, and so we'll get longer introductions of them in a bit. But just first, a little bit of background on the Forest Climate Working Group for those of you who might be new. The Forest Climate Working Group has been together for over 8 years, and our goal from the very beginning was to bring together a diverse cross-section of players in the forest sector, representing all perspectives on different ways that forests can help address climate change, both climate mitigation through carbon capture, as well as addressing climate adaptation issues. And we've been really active and I think very successful in providing both a forum for learning and dialogue, and then also developing consensus ideas that we've been able to present to policymakers as a way forward on these issues. And so this year we've done a couple of new things we just want to let folks know about. One is that we've just recently initiated a new membership and endorsement process. We've been operating with somewhat of an informal membership over the last few years to maximize participation, and concluded, given that we're at such an interesting transition moment in forest climate policy, that we really wanted to reaffirm our core principles as the Forest Climate Work Group. What are those things we all agree on about the role of forests in addressing climate change, and then really clarify those organizations that embrace those principles and wanted to be formally connected together as members of the Forest Climate Working Group going forward. So if there are any organizations that are participating in this call that haven't seen the entry principles and are interested, please contact Rita Height or myself or Dave Cleaves, and we'd love to share those with you and invite you to become a member organization. The other thing that we're focused on right now and represented by today's initial learning session is fostering a really intensive sharing of information among the groups that are driving forest climate work right now, everything from groups that are working on the science side all the way to different kinds of public and private leaders in on-the-ground implementation. What does it look like to do forest conservation and management and stewardship in a changing climate? And so we're really excited for this to be an opportunity. We've spent so much time, the Forest Climate Working Group, kind of talking to each other about about the Forest Climate Working Group and our shared agenda. This is really a chance for us to create a forum for learning from each other and bringing in outside experts from around the country to make sure that we're looking at the most current information about how to maximize the positive connections between forests and climate change. So thanks very, very much for joining today, and I want to turn it over to my very long-time co-chair, Rita Height from American Forest Foundation, to see, Rita, if you have anything you want to share.
Scott, I think you've covered everything. Really excited to have our first session here where we can learn from some experts. So thanks. I really appreciate Lauren's time on this too.
Okay, well, oh, sorry, is there anything else?
No, I was just going to say the floor is yours, Lauren.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, and it's a really great opportunity for us as the Forest Carbon and Climate Program here at MSU to kind of come in here at the learning opportunity and support the Forest Climate Working Group. So today we have some great speakers, and we're really grateful that they've both been able to join on pretty short notice. First, we have Chris Swanston, is the director of NIACS, which is the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and he's also the director of the U.S. Forest Service Northern Forest Climate Hub. He'll be talking about carbon stewardship in the context of climate change, and we'll go over the science and management techniques related to carbon from the perspective of the U.S. Forest Service today. And he will also highlight their brand new publication that just came out last Monday, Considering Forest and Grassland Carbon in Land Management. So very good timing on that side. And then we'll have Sheldon Zakreski, is the director of Asset Management for the Climate Trust. And Sheldon's role there is to negotiate and manage offset project agreements and the programs that provide the Climate Trust the source of offset funding to project owners. The Climate Trust is a nonprofit that has been involved in carbon markets for the past 20 years, and he'll be talking about a shifting outlook on climate and forest carbon investment. And so with that said, let's dive into our first speaker. Chris, will you please share the screen and begin your presentation?
You betcha, working on it.
Okay.
All right, how are we doing? You guys see that?
Yes.
Yep, we do.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much for this opportunity to speak with all of you today. And I'll cover a little bit about carbon stewardship, also how to think about carbon stewardship within the broader context of a changing climate. I know that there are a lot of people on the call who have been thinking hard about this topic for a long time. For some of you, this will be a very basic presentation. For others, you might get some new ideas. As one of the first sessions, I think the first session in this learning series, I wanted to start to sort of set a little bit of a foundation so that future speakers can get down and dirty. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. Oh, before I go any further, I also want to acknowledge my co-author, although she's not listed there, Maria Genoviak, who helped create this presentation and is generally my co-conspirator in whatever I do. And speaking of that, to that publication that just came out of our national headquarters, it was led by Marilyn Buford and Maria Genoviak, and it covers carbon within a global context, within a forest ecosystem context, within a management context. It also describes many current Forest Service policies and approaches to forest carbon management as of the printing of this document, and lays out just some basic principles about thinking about carbon management. We're really excited that this came out, and we hope to get some feedback on it as we progress and continue thinking about this subject into the future. So I'm going to basically approach this from a direction of why do we care about carbon, and then what can we do about the carbon that we care about. First, I'm going to cover some basic terms and units, not exactly people's most favorite thing to think about, but just to get some clarification in here, I'm going to talk about stocks of carbon. Generally, the number you'll hear is gigatons. Sometimes you'll hear petagrams, and oftentimes you'll also hear a metric ton described of carbon. But in general, for the big global numbers, gigatons and petagrams, maybe teragrams, which is a smaller unit of petagram, 1,000 times less than a petagram. Okay, then there's a flux. So this is a amount of change per year. So, for example, gigatons or petagrams per year. And then a density. And that is an amount per some space or volume, so metric tons per hectare, for example. And so these are kind of three different ways to describe the measures of carbon on Earth and in forests. So why do we care about carbon? First and foremost, well, Garrett, as a carbon scientist, I just like thinking about carbon. I'll just throw that right out there. And if we weren't worried about climate change, I would still like thinking about carbon. I would say that for most people, maybe normal people, they're thinking about carbon because of the greenhouse effect. And so we've all been hearing about this for years. Of course, most of our warmth on Earth comes from the sun. About half of it in shortwave radiation bounces off of the upper atmospheric clouds and the Earth, and about half is absorbed and re-radiated as long-wave radiation. That is captured by these peculiar molecules called greenhouse gases and re-emitted as heat within our atmosphere. And so without the greenhouse gas effect, we would all be dead. The Earth would be a frozen ball of ice. With it, very nicely, we've got a temperature on average of about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That said, we're adding, of course, a few extra greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and that is warming the Earth at a prodigious rate. Now, folks will ask, and we're hearing this a lot, and I have always been hearing it a lot, well, the climate has always changed, and how can we know how the climate changes, what the causes are, and whether it's humans that are having an effect? At this point, you won't really find any climate scientists who are saying that the Earth's climate is not changing. And what this graphic illustrates are these 7 papers that have canvassed published literature as well as surveyed publishing climate scientists to see what the consensus is on what's causing our current contemporary global warming. And really, most climate scientists feel that in the last 50 years, especially, humans, and namely greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion, are the primary causes of our climate change right now. And you can see, if you look back through time, you can see how that has changed through time. And one emphasis you'll hear is really on that past 50 years as us becoming the primary cause. Prior to that, really there were multiple causes, and we were one of them for slight warming. But really in that last 50 years, you can see that there's been a huge uptick in the fossil fuel emissions and really the conversion of those emissions into the land, the ocean, and what's retained in the atmosphere. And that leads to a question of, yeah, that looks like it's a big flux, but you know, isn't there already a lot of carbon? Isn't that really just a drop in the bucket? So to look at global carbon stocks, so we just saw fluxes, now we're into stocks, so this is the amount of carbon that you see out there on Earth. Really most of it, and this is a nice bubble diagram that I like using, really most of it is there in the deep ocean, and that really cycles on the scale of thousands of years. But if you look at the surface ocean and then soils and vegetation, you have somewhat smaller bubbles or stocks of carbon. Those cycle much more quickly. Permafrost ideally cycles at a much slower rate. You look at the current atmosphere and that bubble, 839 gigatons of carbon. And then down there, look at the cumulative industrial emissions. And so this is these are the emissions that have been put into the atmosphere and then have since gone into these different bubbles since the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the 1750s. And so when you look, and then of course there's land use change, which is also added. So when you look at those two bubbles relative to the other bubbles, you see that in fact, you know, we haven't dominated the carbon cycle with these emissions, but we have added a significant amount. And so to that question of how can we change something as massive as the atmosphere, it's really by adding massive amounts of carbon into it. If we just look at the last 10 years or so and how that has been parceled out, you have about a gigaton of carbon, slightly less actually, coming from land use change, and then not quite 9.5 gigatons of carbon from fossil fuel emissions. You see about 44% of that remaining in the atmosphere, 31% going into Earth's biomass, and about 25% on land, and about 25% going into the ocean. If you look much further back and think about trends, you'll see in the red that these are forest carbon balances. That red is emissions, and so really through land use change and cutting of forests all around the world, there have been emissions worldwide from forests into the atmosphere. Only in really recent decades has that trend flipped in a couple of places, namely the USA and Europe, in which those areas have become net sinks of carbon in forests. If we look more specifically at the United States, and this is some classic work done by Linda Heath and Rich Burgee over time, what you get is you can see all the way back into 1635 some stasis in whether the forests are calculated as net emitters or net sequesterers. But as you have more and more land clearing with settlement and the Industrial Revolution, really there was a massive amount of emissions that were coming from American forests and going into the atmosphere. That changed with demographics and the way that we were farming in the early 1900s, in which case over a relatively short period of time, by the 1950s, the United States forests were net sources of a net sink. So they were net sequestering carbon. Now, at this point, we're thinking of annual U.S. emissions. About 16% are sequestered in U.S. forests. Now, this sets up the question, really, of can we maintain this, and for how long? In the 2014 National Climate Assessment, which reported on the 2014 RPA assessment, Resource Planning Act assessment done by the U.S. Forest Service, they estimated that under a few scenarios, really the high scenario as well as the low scenario of both emissions and changes in forest cover, from about the mid-2020s to 2040, we're really looking at U.S. forests becoming a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. And
Chris,
so that...
1 minute. I'm sorry. Can we have our folks calling in on the phone, can you just double check that you're muted? We're getting quite a bit of rustling sound. It can be a little bit distracting. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt. I thought you were between slides.
No worries. Okay, so really the question here is, you know, what's going to happen in the future, both with land use change and with emissions from forests into the atmosphere, just with climate change. So as we're thinking about that, you know, we're wanting to think about mitigation and how can we do our best to ensure that we manage our forests in a way that don't leave them emitting carbon in the atmosphere as a net source to the atmosphere, in the 2020s or 2030s. And we can think about this in three main ways, really, about enhancing forest cover, intentionally increasing sequestration in forests, and then using the products from forests in ways that either store them as sequestered carbon or offsets fossil fuel use. And so just to go in a little bit more depth into those ideas, right now, forests store more carbon than really just about any other land use. You can see this both in the western and the eastern United States. Those are the big green bars on the right and the left. And then in the eastern U.S., of course, you also have a lot of carbon stored in wetlands. So really avoiding conversion of those forests to other uses is a big deal. And so when you have projected forest losses of 2 to 4%, that's a significant carbon loss. On the flip side of that is really trying to increase forest coverage, especially afforestation of non-forested lands, again, especially if they have not been forested in the past. And so that's reversing land conversion from urban areas or also from agricultural areas. And really also, when you have urban areas and it's not going back into forest, to think about really focusing on urban forests and growing both street trees and open spaces within urban forests. The other is avoiding a decrease, or that is decreasing your losses of carbon from engaging in forest management. And so an example of avoiding this loss of carbon from forests would be managing the forest in such a way that wildfire is less destructive to the forest. And so this may include more active management, for example, of fuels within the forest system so that the living trees or larger trees overstory aren't consumed by more severe fires. Also working on avoiding disturbance of the forest floor especially, but also soils more generally during harvest because those are a concentrated source, or rather a concentrated stock of carbon within the system, and disturbing that stock can lead to a source of carbon from the system. We also want to think about emissions from the machinery and the supply chain in the sense of is it possible to reduce those in any sort of practical way? So in terms of thinking about increasing our forest growth and our carbon stocks within the forest, as we're thinking about reforestation, we all know that there is a significant backlog of disturbed or harvested lands and that are in need of reforestation, as much as a 10-year backlog over about 50 million acres. And if we think about an aggressive attempt to reforest those in the very near term, as well as little as 5% of agricultural lands that are marginal, we could potentially sequester an additional 2 to 3 gigatons of carbon over the next 100 years. And so that can be 20 to 30 teragrams of carbon annually. Well, on average, it would really pay out over the latter part of that time. Also, improve seedlings that help ensure that you gain from your cost of planting or grow faster or denser to store more carbon within the trees and survive oncoming climate change and or other disturbances. There's also fertilization. There are an awful lot of places within the United States where the trees will grow faster put on more biomass at fertilize. You just need to account for the carbon cost of both creating the fertilizer and distributing it. Oops. And then finally, forest management of all kinds to improve tree growth. And a lot of the time, this also comes back to the previous slide where that same management will ideally decrease fuel loads and decrease the effects of severe wildfire. And then there's wood products and energy. So this is the idea that if you can divert your wood products into longer-lived consumer products such as single-family homes, you basically keep that carbon out of the atmosphere for a much longer time. So it's not just about what's in the forest, it's about what goes from the forest and into products. And then also, when we think about using wood for fuel of various sorts, and especially if that wood is being used to substitute for fossil fuels, then we avoid putting those fossil fuels into the atmosphere. Oh well, I skipped slides on you. So this slide is what I was just said, but I got ahead of myself a little bit. All right. I'll say here though that you know, we can define, if we like, that the bioenergy is carbon neutral. I think if you do the numbers, it's a little bit more complex than that, which we all know. And of course, that's like many of the slides in this talk, an entire talk in and of itself. Like I said, we're just taking a very swift overview of this subject. Okay. So when we think about greenhouse gas mitigation in forests, one of the big issues here is that you get papers coming out and they are created in one forest that grows in one part of the country with one or several species of trees that are completely unlike other forests. And so there's a lot to consider in terms of the scale at which you're thinking about forest growth and interaction and management of the forest, and that includes not just spatial scale, but your temporal scale as well. And so it's important that we're comparing apples with apples when we're discussing this subject. And as we're doing that, it's important that we're clear about the parameters of our analysis. If we're doing some kind of a life cycle analysis, for example, it's critical that when we're discussing these life cycle analyses or the carbon cost of management in any way, shape, or form, that we're all using similar parameters or clear how those parameters differ and the effect of those different parameters on the numbers that we're really comparing at the end of the analysis. In other words, be clear about what your numbers are for each one of these boxes. Think about what your life cycle really looks at and what really is affecting it. Now, as we think about mitigation in all those ways, of course, the elephant in the room is, again, why are we thinking about carbon mitigation? We're thinking about carbon mitigation because climate change is a real issue. And so we can make all kinds of great plans to mitigate carbon within forests while ignoring the potential for those forests to suffer from the changing climate. And all of our actions can be undone. So it really behooves us to think about adaptation and mitigation simultaneously. And I want to emphasize these really aren't mutually exclusive. A lot of the actions, and I'm not going to read all of these, that one would ideally take in adapting forests to the changing climate are really also helping to maintain as much carbon and living biomass as possible. And so a lot of the time these actions, they really are not only not mutually exclusive, but they are mutually beneficial. So I want to just summarize some of what I've gone over in some principles, and one of those, and I think the critical one, is to really emphasize ecosystem function and resilience. And the function is a critical aspect of us coping with the issue of climate change and thinking about how the system is a functional living system and how our management interacts with that system. You know, are we able to either promote its resilience or help facilitate its transition into a different but resilient system? And that is really all about function. And so even as we're thinking about carbon, it's critical that we're thinking about the function of the system. And that means that while we recognize carbon as an increasingly important aspect of a forest ecosystem service, it's really one of many ecosystem services that we are managing for. In some cases, this will mean that we actually may sacrifice carbon on the landscape for some other ecosystem service, such as habitat, maybe for a threatened or endangered or just cherished animal, for example, which requires in its habitat an early sterile stage, which carries less carbon in it than an older stage. So in that case, we may sacrifice carbon for some other ecosystem service that we value more highly in that place. So this is one of those balances that people do everywhere in forests as they're thinking about what their values are in that system. Carbon as an ecosystem service doesn't change that analysis other than adding a new ecosystem service to the mix. And so as we're thinking about that idea, that is really just continuing to support a diversity of approaches. And that diversity is both about thinking about how to manage for carbon in different types of ecosystems while supporting other values as well as co-benefits, but also just trying new things out in terms of adaptation. Because with climate adaptation, we're all learning and we're needing to learn rapidly. One thing to really consider as we're putting all of this together is basically how the system works, how it works across different scales, so how it works across different scales, and how we can facilitate making decisions in a coordinated manner across larger scales, and considering dynamics that are both ecological but also industrial. And as we're doing that, again, using all of the information we have at hand and sharing that information as quickly and as transparently as possible. So thanks very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Hopefully I came in not too far over time.
So thank you so much, Chris. So let's see if I can pull this back up for a minute. And so we are next, I think that was really great, and I know a lot of folks are probably looking forward to taking a peek at the recent report and referencing it in their materials. I know that I am. And so we'll move now into part two. And Sheldon, if you're ready, we're just going to kind of dive right in. Considering time, I'd like to get a couple questions in at the end. So Sheldon, if you're ready, would you please share your screen and begin your presentation?
Sure thing. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sheldon Zakreski with the Climate Trust, and I'm going to sort of provide just a kind of a high-level outlook of carbon markets and what it might mean for forest carbon projects. And in the interest of time, I'll try to accelerate my presentation, keep it till about 10 minutes, so just folks have some time for questions, and we can get out of here at the top of the hour. So, just quickly going to provide a quick overview of the Climate Trust, talk a little bit about some of the different international, national, subnational, and then just voluntary market trends we're seeing, and how investors, those who are, interested in kind of funding projects that have carbon benefits are perceiving these different trends, and then just kind of finish off a little bit on what that might mean, in terms of some ideas the Climate Trust has around kind of mitigating some of the uncertainties we're seeing. So just a quick overview of the Climate Trust. We've been around for about 20 years. We got started as an act of legislation in the state of Oregon that anytime anybody built a new fossil-fired power plant, they had to mitigate their carbon. And the way most folks did that was they provided funding to us. So we kind of used that funding to go out, look for, fund, and manage different carbon offset projects. And we've kind of leveraged that experience into different voluntary markets and compliance markets such as California. So I guess just in terms of a breakdown of sort of the things I kind of wanted to touch on about with kind of carbon markets, just kind of briefly at the international level, kind of talk a little bit about Paris and what that means nationally and the market impact. I'm going to talk about a market that's starting in the aviation sector, and then talk a little bit about California and the voluntary. So just kind of diving in, nationally, just in terms of what's been going on sort of at the federal level, and what we've sort of seen is the Trump administration withdrawing from Paris. They've also repealed the Clean Power Plan, and they also want to repeal a oil and gas methane capture standards. And so, while there's been a lot of press about it, I mean, I think the market impact is something that's really, negligible to kind of quantify. I mean, while it's definitely dampened, sentiment and sort of given, more of a bearish outlook on the growth of carbon markets, in this country, I guess the point I'd want to sort of stress in a lot of these actions, with respect to Paris, it was a set of principles. A lot of the, the details and sausage making hadn't really been figured out. In terms of federal policies that the Obama administration had, passed, they were what I'd kind of call regulatory-oriented policies, where there really wasn't a role for, forest carbon offset projects to play. So, we can't really say that there's been a market impact apart from sort of a bearish sentiment from these actions. Market that, we are seeing that folks, domestically could take advantage of is the International Civil Aviation Organization market. The acronym is called ICOA. And last year they passed a global carbon offset scheme. And this is something that's going to kind of kick off in the 2020s. And, sort of designed to at least run through, about 2020, 2035. And they'll be sort of, starting in the 2030s, reviewing it every year. And this is a, interesting market to sort of, track and see how it takes shape. Because just in terms of the market size, what we're sort of seeing is that, over its first 15 years, we think that, some of the forecasts we've seen is there would be a demand for about 1.5 billion offsets. And that's just, it's a strictly offset sort of dominated market, because what the aviation sector is kind of looking at in terms of, being able to cap and reduce their carbon footprint will be a whole new fleet of airplanes, a whole new fleet of advanced fuels, and those are things that are going to take decades before we start seeing results. So, we're looking at a market in the 2020s, early 2030s that, to put in context is an order of magnitude greater than the California compliance market, which is the, kind of biggest market around in the United States to date. value-wise, however, with this market, because it is a global market and they're able to draw on, offsets from all over the place, probably sort of seeing prices start out in the upper single digits, which, maybe a few dollars below what we're seeing currently for California. The trick with this, I guess, is that a lot of the kind of accounting and the sort of infrastructure for this type of market, has yet to be figured out. So, if you're kind of looking at it from a project, landowner perspective or investor perspective, this thing is several years out. A whole lot of rules need to be made, so it's something worth tracking, but not yet something to act upon. Then we've got the California market, and this is a market that came into place in 2013, and essentially it's a cap and trade. And just briefly to kind of talk about that, what California done is they've capped about 80 emissions from about 80% of their economy. And the theory is that you can use allowances, which are basically sort of state tender that you can purchase from state auctions, or you could use offsets, and that's limited about 8% to comply with your cap. Just briefly in terms of market size there, what we're seeing with allowances there at about $14, it's above the floor price. In offsets, right now we're seeing things at about $11 per ton. These are actually the sort of strongest prices we've seen from the market in its few years of existence. And that's usually because this is a market that's only 4 years old. There's been a lot of uncertainty. The market demand has been kind of soft because a lot of the other policies have done better than expected at reducing emissions. And also this market's been kind of subject to legal uncertainty, but a lot of the legal uncertainty has been removed. And sort of the current challenge we're looking at now is that sort of policy uncertainty is kind of rearing its head. And that's because this market has been designed to basically last until 2020. And right now they're trying to figure out the legislation for what it will look like post 2020. And the Democrats in California hold sort of 2/3 of the legislature. There's a lot of sort of debate between the more progressive Democrats that want more of a sort of strong regulatory hand in the marketplace, and sort of less of a more market-oriented system. And what this could mean for offsets is there could be a lot of policies that kind of come in to reduce their ceiling, or try to restrict the usage as much as possible to California-based offsets, which would have a dampening impact on the market. Then we have the voluntary market. And with the voluntary market, what that's kind of characterized a lot by is sort of a series of these kind of bilateral transactions. So it's really hard to sort of decipher what is the price of an offset in the voluntary market. If we look at sort of the data that's kind of collected annually from the authoritative source on voluntary markets, we see an average price of $3, but you see a really broad distribution of prices from less than $1 a ton to there are projects that are getting $20 a ton. And that depends on a lot of variables, such as the location of the project, the vintage of the offsets. So one of the ways I always tell people to think about offsets is to think about it like the market for automobiles. You can buy an old clunker for $800, or you could buy a new Tesla for $80,000. And you sort of see the same type of distribution when it comes to voluntary. So in terms of what this means for investors, those folks that are looking to try to fund these projects, is if I look across, nationally, internationally, California, and in the voluntary market, is there's sort of a lot of uncertainty, and trying to see how a lot of things might be taking shape. particularly in California, and then also in the voluntary market. One of the things I forgot to mention that earlier that we're sort of tracking is the use of kind of carbon buyer clubs, because there's a lot of buyers that have sort of decided to kind of step up and sort of fill the void around Paris, but there isn't a lot of details, around what that might look like or how buyers might go about in terms of what share offsets might play, in terms of their Paris commitments. So a couple of, initiatives the Climate Trust has kind of launched as a way to try to, mitigate against this sort of, policy uncertainty, and, just because of this policy uncertainty, creates a bit of a lack of confidence in terms of what, future carbon prices might be like, or what the future carbon market might look like is, one, we've launched a carbon fund that's kind of designed to capture the long-term value, sort of the 10-year value of carbon offsets from a project. And we're going to do this by structuring an offering that provides an upfront, guaranteed upfront investment amount for that project. And then we try to, that helps to maybe design against mitigating the, the price risk from future markets. And, we mitigate against the delivery risk by not sort of requiring a fixed guarantee from any project owner that would take our investment. And, if markets beat expectations and there's a lot of upside, we're sort of proposing to share that upside with folks. Another risk mitigation thing that we kind of are going to be offering is a environmental price assurance facility. And the Climate Trust just got an award from USDA. They have conservation innovation grants. And so what we want to do is take a concept piloted by the World Bank, to the market for domestic agriculture and forestry projects. And basically, the concept that we're sort of thinking of is to auction off put option agreements. And what a put option agreement does is that it allows the holder, it gives them the right, but not the obligation to sell offsets at a fixed price to the issuer. And so, what we're hoping that sort of does is that, folks that are, sort of enter into these put option agreements with us is they then have a fixed price, a fixed price floor basically for their carbon, and hopefully that's enough to enable them to sort of move forward with these projects and go forward. And so, if the market does take off in the future, these folks are then able to, not exercise the put option agreement and sell their offsets for a higher price. But if the market doesn't take off, they know that, for all their risk and effort and dollars spent, they're not going to get, $0 in terms of the carbon they create. So that's the end of my presentation. So I guess I'll hand it back to you, Lauren.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Let's see here. Well, we have time for a couple of questions. So, and if anyone else has more questions, you're welcome to still submit them. I have a couple of short ones and kind of a more broad question. So I guess we can do some of the clarifying questions here for your presentations to start. This one's for you, Chris. You mentioned, or that you gave a list of management activities, but it doesn't look like you had mentioned or listed lengthening rotation cycles. Was there a reason for that, or could you comment on that as an approach to improve carbon management?
Sure. That wasn't explicitly listed, but it was just kind of binned in one of those bullets. And I think that lengthening rotation cycles is a good way to keep more carbon in biomass, and that different versions of that are increasing your size, your age class of the stock you have in the forest. And that doesn't preclude active management of the forest. You can increase your size classes and still continue. In some forests, if you're not doing regeneration harvest, you can still continue to maintain an overall higher age of stocking while still removing some trees from the forest. But even if you are doing regeneration harvest, patch cuts, you can still be thinking again on a landscape basis and maintain an overall higher age or size of your trees through longer rotations across a larger landscape. So yeah, that was a good question, good point.
Thank you for that. And Sheldon, we had a question that, do you know why there was on one of your slides it showed a sharp change in the carbon pricing in early April. Do you know why that was?
Yeah, let me go back. So let's see if that was, okay. Yeah, and so, as I kind of mentioned, that one of the things like impacting the California market was legal uncertainty. So right when the cap and trade market was passed, the California Chamber of Commerce filed a lawsuit basically trying to argue that the process of auctioning off allowances was a tax and you needed a 2/3 yes vote. And so what happened was the initial court case, they lost that challenge, the Cal Chamber did, and then there was a state appeals, a court case, and the state appeals ruled in favor of the state, sort of saying that auctioning allowances is not a tax. And so it's like basically that led to that sort of, uptick in the market because it just sort of lifted this kind of cloud of legal uncertainty over the market.
Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And now this next question, I'm assuming this. Well, you both may know about this a little bit. This touches on the debate, which is currently still definitely ongoing, about whether burning biomass is carbon neutral. And so the question is, regarding the debate whether burning biomass to create energy is carbon neutral, carbon negative, or carbon positive, is technology available to produce biochar as a byproduct in biomass energy plants? So I guess there would probably be two things. First, if you could comment on your general perception on that, the carbon neutrality question, and then if you know if there's technology that's using a biochar byproduct in biomass energy plants.
I can take the second one. I'm not a scientist by any means, but with respect to biochar, my understanding is that still largely, pilot scale technology. I do believe there is a lumber company in Oregon where I think this is mostly due to the interest of the owner. They have a small biochar plant. I'm not sure if that's integrated as part of their, overall plant. And that, I think a lot of what I've heard about it is they've just been sort of piloting the biochar plant, just to sort of get a better handle on how it works.
Okay, thanks for that.
I'll jump in and just say that I think that there's somewhat of a difference between policy and the numbers. And again, how you define neutrality really depends on what your parameters of a life cycle analysis are. But I think that in terms of biochar, if you include that in a life cycle analysis, I think you get probably your best chances of neutrality, and with somewhat less efficiency in different types of plants that can produce biochar. You can then, essentially the idea, of course, is take that biochar and integrate it into soils where it should have a longer lifespan. And I think that there are lots of pilots and tests of this going on around the United States and around the world. I would say that at this point, there's somewhat mixed results. It's not a slam dunk, but it's a really neat idea, and in some places, I think it can work really well.
Thanks for that. I think we're almost done, but I thought maybe we could ask one more kind of broader question, since you both have pretty different perspectives as far as your outlook and your day-to-day work, even though in similar topics. I thought you could just maybe both comment briefly on, since we're a group that focuses on carbon and climate issues, what do you see from each of your perspectives as our strategic leverage points or communication avenues going forward from here on this topic? Chris, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I think it's powerful to mix the idea of adaptation and mitigation in the same discussion, if at all possible. I'll say right up front that there's still a lot of resistance out in the field about mitigation outright because of the troubles that we've had with markets over the last decade or two, but people are also just interested in doing the right thing, and so they want to pursue carbon capture in forests as a co-benefit to the other things, the other values that they have in that forest. I think that one great way to engage with people who want to maintain their values in working forests is this idea that really adaptation, sure, it will happen on its own, but not necessarily in a way that will maintain our values in the forest. If we can actively work with our forests and manage them, we can help soften the landing that they're going to have in this changing climate while we pursue things like mitigation, but also clean air, clean water, wildlife, and wood products. So I think that this idea of both carbon and adaptation are not in any way mutually exclusive with a working forest.
Thank you so much. Sheldon, do you have anything else to add, or from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's definitely a lot to leverage, from forests, I mean, especially on the co-benefits side. I think the thing to sort of, leverage from my mind is what we sort of see a lot when people talk about, climate and policy and reduction. It's wrapped up in terms of clean energy policy. And I think what people maybe don't realize or knows is that land use accounts for about, maybe about 15 to 20% of sort of the climate change pie. So I think, one of the things to sort of, leverage is trying to be louder in our communications on, the very critical role, land use, change and land use, management that mitigate carbon can play actually in sort of, reducing global climate change.
Yeah, very good. Well, I think, and thank you so much for those answers. And I think that will close us out for today. Again, big thank you to our guests. I really appreciate the time and the short notice. And to both Jad and Rita for their support through the Forest Climate Working Group. And I don't know, Rita or Jad, if you had anything else to say before we sign off here?
Well, this is Jad Daly from American Forest. I'll just echo thanks to you, Lauren, and to everyone else, to our panelists and to Dave. And just a last closing note, we talked about why are we doing these, these learning sessions. And I think that one of the things that you heard today, and you're going to hear a lot in the sessions to come, including the very next one in July, is a real emphasis on applying what we know about forests and climate change, to the real world context of how we're all trying to move forward. Things like the policy and funding mechanisms that can actually drive change in activity out there on the ground. So just as, for example, in our future sessions, we'll be getting into things like additional state-level laws beyond California that are driving and programs that are driving new activity, and going into greater depth and some of the potential mechanics of that, airlines, offset markets, and some of the things that were touched on briefly today. So this is really a preview of, as Chris and Sheldon both said, of kind of a broad set of topics that we're just going to go more and more deeply on over time, and really hope that folks will continue to join us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to chime in again, Jad, on that, we welcome people to reach out to us on those kinds of topics too. So we'll be looking for ideas from the Forest Climate Working Group and others that think that they can contribute and bring knowledge to the table. We'd be happy to talk to you. You can reach out to me directly. Well, okay, if that's it, thank you so much for everybody's time. And again, I'll be in touch with some information on where this is posted to the group, so for people that weren't able to join, but we'll also have the slides and some additional Q&A on there because there were a couple of questions we didn't get to. And that's it. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.